I stood before the grand glass entrance of the Rolling Hills Country Club, staring at my mother like she had spoken to me in a foreign language. It took 7 grueling hours of driving through endless construction zones, surviving on stale gas station coffee, and battling the suffocating Kentucky summer heat to get here from Fort Campbell. I spent 2 weeks fighting for leave approval. Because my military unit was dangerously short-staffed, also I could see my little sister walk down the aisle. Yet here was my mother physically blocking the doorway, looking at me as if I were a trespasser rather than her oldest daughter. I let out a dry laugh, not out of amusement, but because my brain simply refused to process the absurdity of the moment. When I asked her what she meant, she folded her arms tightly across her chest, a universal gesture she used whenever she had firmly made up her mind about something. She told me that Emily wanted an intimate, small family gathering, which was a laughable lie given the surroundings. I looked past her shoulder and saw valet parking, attendants sprinting back and forth, 2 massive white reception tents, a string quartet playing by the fountain, and at least 100 guests mingling in their Sunday best. My father quietly stepped up beside her, his voice a low murmur as he urged her not to do this. Hearing those specific words made my stomach churn because they implied that my presence was the problem, as if showing up for my sibling was an act of hostility. Through the open ballroom doors, I could see elegant waiters carrying silver trays filled with champagne glasses, and the entire venue was practically overflowing with expensive imported white roses. I knew exactly how much a display like that cost because I spent the last decade wiring money home to cover various family emergencies, meaning I essentially financed the backdrop of my own exclusion. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion settled over me, the kind of weariness that takes decades of emotional neglect to fully build up. I asked where Emily was, and my mother hesitated, which gave me all the answers I truly needed. I scanned the crowded room and spotted my 32-year-old sister standing near the grand staircase in a flawless, beautiful wedding gown. For a fraction of a second, our eyes locked across the distance, but instead of waving or smiling, she coldly averted her gaze and pretended I was invisible. That silent rejection cut deeper than any words my parents could have possibly engineered in that moment. Standing there in the heat, memories flashed back to when we were children, like the times Emily would come home crying from school and I would hold her hand, help her with homework, and protect her from bullies. When our father was laid off, I took a grueling second job during community college just to ensure Mom could keep the lights on. And I regularly sent chunks of my military deployment pay to fix their endless financial crises. I was always the reliable protector, yet I was currently barred from entering while complete strangers celebrated inside. My mother cleared her throat nervously, suggesting that I could still watch the entire ceremony online through a live stream link she could text me. My father nodded in agreement, muttering that this arrangement was probably for the best for everyone involved. I wish I could tell you that I caused a massive scene, that I marched into that ballroom and loudly exposed every single one of their hypocrisies in front of their wealthy guests. But heartbreak doesn't always make you loud. Sometimes it drains the air right out of your lungs and leaves you entirely silent. I took one final look at my mother, my father, and the sister who still refused to acknowledge me before quietly telling them that I understood. I turned around and walked back across the baking asphalt toward my vehicle, my boots heavy against the pavement. Nobody called out my name, nobody ran after me to apologize, and nobody tried to stop me from leaving. That is the detail that sticks with me the most from that afternoon. Just how incredibly effortless it was for my own flesh and blood to let me walk away. The parking lot felt radiating, hot as I climbed into the cab of my truck and shut the door, cutting off the distant sound of the violin music. I sat there in total silence with my hands resting on the steering wheel, watching more wedding guests arrive with beautifully wrapped gifts while families walked past laughing. The entire world kept spinning as if my heart had not just been shattered into pieces, reminding me how insignificant I was to them. I finally started the engine, and the country music station I had been listening to earlier immediately flooded the speakers, but it just sounded like mocking noise now. I drove a mile down the road before my phone buzzed on the console, displaying a digital notification for the wedding livestream invitation. A dark laugh escaped my throat as I flipped the device face down on the passenger seat, refusing to give them the satisfaction of my viewership. After 40 minutes of mindless driving, I pulled into a crowded travel stop off Interstate 65, surrounded by the smell of diesel fuel, cheap fast food, and fresh coffee. Hundreds of truckers and travelers moved past my windows, completely oblivious to my existence, and that anonymity felt like the most comforting thing in the entire world. I sat in my truck watching strangers go about their day while my phone continuously lit up with text, messages from extended relatives, sharing photos of smiling faces and wedding cake. No one asked where I was, and no one seemed to notice that the oldest sibling was entirely missing from every single family photograph. I opened a chat window to Emily and typed out 3 separate messages demanding an explanation. But I ultimately deleted every single word because the truth was already painfully obvious. If my sister had actually wanted me standing by her side, I would have been inside that building instead of sitting in a truck stop parking lot. The harsh reality settled over me like a suffocating winter blanket, forcing me to confront the illusions I had maintained for years. I had constantly lied to myself, believing that my parents finally respected my boundaries, that Emily appreciated my sacrifices, and that I would eventually feel like a true member of the family. Sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of that gas station, I realized I had spent my entire adult life desperately begging for a place that should have been given to me freely. I was suddenly so tired of proving my worth, tired of paying their debts, and tired of being valued only when I was being useful. A strange sense of tranquility washed over me once. I finally admitted that painful truth to myself, leaving me deeply hurt but incredibly grounded. Outside, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple as semi-trucks pulled back onto the highway. I wiped a stray tear from my eye, shifted the truck into drive, and spoke a quiet vow into the empty cabin that nobody else would ever hear. I was completely done begging for their love, and though I believed the worst of the betrayal was behind me, I had no idea that the wedding was merely the opening act. 12 days later, I was sitting inside a cramped motor pool office at Fort Campbell, staring blankly at a complex logistics spreadsheet. It was a miserable Tuesday afternoon, sticky with humidity and the annoying backup beep of a military transport vehicle. Outside was rattling the thin walls. Every few seconds, my coffee had grown ice cold. My old training injury was causing my left knee to throb, and my foot was throbbing inside my combat boot. This was the unglamorous reality of military life, far removed from the polished recruitment commercials. When my phone suddenly buzzed against the metal desk with the caller ID reading Mom, I stared at her name for several long seconds before picking up, noting that she had not reached out once since casting me out of the country club. There had been no checking in, no hollow apologies, and no text messages attempting to smooth over the emotional damage they had inflicted. When I finally answered with a guarded hello, she completely bypassed any pleasantries and aggressively demanded to know why her financial card was being declined. I pulled the phone away from my ear in sheer confusion, asking her what on earth she was talking about. She snapped back that the wedding venue had just contacted her claiming the final payment transaction failed, and she expected me to handle it. I leaned back in my creaking office chair, completely stunned, and offered a flat response that clearly irritated her based on the sharp silence that followed. She told me not to start drama, explaining that the venue balance was outstanding and that it amounted to $23,000. The sheer magnitude of the number made the room spin, and I stared at my misspelled name on my coffee cup just to keep my anchor in reality. I explicitly pointed out that she was asking me to liquidate my savings for a luxury wedding that I was actively barred from attending. She made a disgusting sound of disapproval, telling me to stop being dramatic, which was an incredible accusation given the circumstances. I reminded her that I had driven 7 hours, only to be told to watch the event through a screen because Emily supposedly needed peace. My mother countered by saying that Emily now needed financial security as she started her new marriage, casually adding that I was her older sister as if that obligation erased her theft. She tried to justify the crime by explaining that Daniel's wealthy family had massive expectations, and they could not risk embarrassing themselves publicly. I kept my temper tightly checked because I knew that if I yelled, they would immediately paint me as the unhinged, jealous sibling who ruined everything. I calmly informed her that I was absolutely not paying a single dime, which caused her to gasp dramatically as if I were the one acting maliciously. She reminded me that I had a steady military paycheck, completely ignoring the physical and mental toll it took to earn every single dollar of that government money. She nastily remarked that the Army provided me with free housing and medical care, a toxic assumption civilians love to make about service members. They never see the missed holidays, the destroyed joints, the sleepless nights, and the profound personal sacrifices required to earn those basic benefits. I sharply responded that the United States military does not exist to fund imported roses for people who treat me like garbage. Her voice cracked with venom as she informed me that my legal name was already printed on the financial paperwork, so I needed to resolve it immediately. A chilling silence enveloped the office as those words hung in the air, and I stood up to slam the door shut to ensure privacy. I demanded to know what paperwork she was referring to, and she casually explained. It was a standard secondary venue guarantor document that Emily had prepared. My mouth went completely dry because I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed a single document involving their wedding. When she realized she had trapped herself, her tone shifted from anger to a desperate, fearful plea for me not to make the situation ugly. I told her the situation became ugly the moment they decided to steal my identity, before promptly hanging up the call with shaking hands. I spent my days managing thousands of dollars of military equipment and briefing high-ranking officers, yet my mother could still make me feel like a defenseless child. After taking a few deep breaths to steady my racing pulse, I looked up the contact information for the Rolling Hills Country Club and dialed their office. A woman answered with a polished professional greeting, but the moment I identified myself, her voice dropped into a concerned, serious tone. She admitted they had been trying to contact me regarding the balance, and I firmly requested immediate copies of every document bearing my signature. When she asked if there was a legal dispute, I told her directly that I had never authorized any financial agreements for my sister's celebration. 5 minutes later, a large PDF file arrived in my digital inbox, and when I opened it, my heart sank directly into my stomach. There was my full legal name, my military email address, a clear scan of my driver's license, and an electronic signature that closely mimicked my own handwriting. Whoever forged the document had successfully copied the general shape of my signature, but they completely missed the subtle looping habit I always used on the first letter. That tiny discrepancy made me physically nauseous because it proved this was a calculated, deliberate attempt to exploit my life for their luxury. It brought back painful memories of 2018, when my father used my credit for an unauthorized loan, an incident I forgave because my mother wept and begged for peace. I realized that when you show mercy to toxic people, they do not see it as a second chance. They view it as an open door. I immediately forwarded the incriminating files to my personal account, printed out hard copies of the contracts, and felt a cold determination replace my panic. They had spent decades manipulating Rachel, the compliant daughter, but they were completely unprepared to deal with Rachel, the trained military, non-commissioned officer. The following morning, I was standing outside the base legal assistance office before the doors were even unlocked, feeling a deep sense of unearned embarrassment. That is the psychological damage families like mine inflict. They somehow make you feel intense shame for the crimes they committed against you. I sat across from a calm JAG attorney named Captain Melissa Grant, who carefully reviewed the fraudulent documents without showing any outward emotion. After a quiet quarter hour, she tapped the forged signature line with her pen and asked me to confirm that I never authorized this agreement. When I confirmed that it was entirely fraudulent, she looked me in the eye and stated that this was a clear case of identity theft and criminal forgery. Hearing an officer use those heavy legal terms made the reality of my family's betrayal feel incredibly real and terrifyingly permanent. She gently advised me that while the emotional fallout belonged to me, I had a strict legal obligation to protect my own security and career first. She instructed me to formally dispute the charges in writing with every single vendor, lock down my credit profiles, and refuse any telephone negotiations. That afternoon, I spent my lunch break sitting in my truck calling the florist, the caterer, the photographer, and the event coordinators one by one. The florist immediately recognized my name, cheerfully mentioning that Emily had explicitly stated I was handling the final floral expenses as a gift. The catering company forwarded an email chain where Emily explicitly wrote that her military sister was her financial backup because I was highly stable. Reading that sentence made me furious, because my own vehicle desperately needed new tires and my furniture was purchased secondhand from online marketplaces. Yet, in my sister's twisted narrative, my single lifestyle meant I was a walking wallet designed to fund her opulent champagne tower. By Friday, I had compiled a neat, professional binder of evidence containing time-stamped phone logs, contradictory emails, and forged addendums that proved a systematic pattern of fraud. On Saturday morning, the venue manager called me back with a tone that was remarkably gentle, explaining she found another critical piece of evidence. She revealed that the recovery email address attached to the electronic signature account belonged to Emily's personal Gmail account, featuring her new married name. Standing barefoot on my kitchen floor, the absolute gravity of my sister's malicious betrayal caused my knees to feel completely weak. I remembered holding her hand on her first day of kindergarten, buying her school supplies, and sending her money from my barracks room when she ruined her credit. The final blow landed when I realized how they obtained the scan of my driver's license that was used to validate the contract. 2 years prior, while I was deployed overseas, my mother called panic-stricken, claiming she needed my identification for urgent family medical insurance paperwork. I sent it immediately because I loved them, completely unaware that she would archive that image to weaponize against my financial stability years later. I called my mother that evening, breaking the legal advice I received, because some pathetic part of me still craved a reality where this was a mistake. When she answered, she immediately accused me of being cruel, but I cut through the manipulation and asked if she gave Emily my identification. The guilty silence on the line was deafening before she weakly made excuses, claiming Emily was simply overwhelmed by the wedding planning stress. I watched their twisted family translation machine operate in real time, where grand theft became stress, absolute lies became pressure, and my self-defense became cruelty. I asked if our father was aware of the scheme, and her thin response confirmed that they had all quietly agreed to let me carry the damage. I barely slept that weekend, consuming stale leftovers and staring at the ceiling until my uniform felt uncomfortably tight on Monday morning. I looked at my 39-year-old reflection in the mirror, seeing the tired lines around my eyes and the physical toll of a decade of military service. A weak part of me actually considered paying the $23,000 just to make the phone stop ringing and buy their temporary affection. But when a final notice email arrived with my name in the subject line, something inside me permanently solidified into iron. I drafted a precise, single-sentence email stating that I did not authorize the charges and entirely disputed any financial responsibility for the events. I attached my timeline of evidence, copied my attorney, and blasted the official dispute to every single vendor associated with the wedding. I froze my credit reports, changed every password I owned, and filed a formal identity theft report with law enforcement authorities. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt incredibly sick to my stomach, but I knew I was finally choosing to save myself instead of preserving their lives. Predictably, the moment the vendors descended on my parents for payment, my phone became a war zone of toxic text messages and hysterical voicemails. Extended relatives I hadn't seen in a decade suddenly surfaced to scold me, completely ignoring the forgery while weeping over Emily's immense wedding stress. I stopped engaging with their emotional theater, responding only with a copy-pasted script, directing all wedding-related communication to my official email address. My mother absolutely despised this boundary, leaving a series of unhinged voicemails alternating between weeping, screaming, and accusing me of destroying the family structure. The following morning, my father attempted a different tactic, texting me that he had always been deeply proud of my honorable military service. I nearly choked on my morning coffee at the sheer audacity of the emergency compliment. Given that he usually criticized my military career for making me too hardened, I forwarded the transparent text message to my closest military friend, who dryly remarked that the compliment was definitely worth framing in gold. For the first time in weeks, genuine laughter echoed through my apartment as I realized it took a massive catering bill for my father to respect my service. The entire situation completely shifted the following Friday when an unknown phone number called my line while I was walking to my truck. When I answered, a hesitant male voice identified himself as Daniel, Emily's new husband, and a heavy silence stretched between us. He admitted that we had never actually met before taking a deep breath and asking me a question that made my blood run completely cold. He asked if it was true that I had maliciously refused to attend their wedding because I didn't support their relationship. Emily had engineered an elaborate narrative where she was the innocent victim and I was the bitter, unsupportive villain who abandoned her. I sat down on a concrete barrier and informed him that I had actually driven 7 hours and was physically turned away at the venue gate. I immediately texted him the time-stamped photograph of the country club entrance alongside the live stream invitation my mother had sent me. He hung up the phone in complete shock, only to call me back an hour, later sounding entirely broken as the reality of his new wife's deception exposed itself. Daniel confessed that Emily had assured him and his parents that her stable military sister was happily covering the remaining balance of the venue. She had treated my life as an infinite safety net, telling everyone that Rachel has plenty of money and Rachel absolutely won't mind the expense. He forwarded me an email where Emily explicitly told him not to worry about the final numbers because I always cleaned up her messes. Seeing those casual words written in black and white made me realize they viewed me as a utility rather than a human being. I realized Daniel was just another victim of their elaborate family grift, so I provided him with copies of the forged documents and the legal reports. 3 days later, my mother called me from a burner number, screaming at the top of her lungs that I had successfully poisoned Daniel against his wife. I told her calmly that the truth was the only thing I provided, and that if reality caused this much destruction, the problem was never me. Daniel sent a final message stating he had canceled the upcoming family gathering and demanded a mandatory confrontation meeting with everyone present. The dramatic reckoning took place on a humid Sunday afternoon inside my Aunt Carol's kitchen in the small town of Owensboro. It was a modest yellow brick house decorated with ceramic garden frogs, an incredibly ordinary setting for the total collapse of my family relationships. I arrived exactly 10 minutes early out of military habit, sitting in my truck to steady my breathing while the summer heat radiated off the hood. Aunt Carol opened the door and pulled me into a fierce, silent embrace that nearly cracked the stoic armor I had spent weeks building up. Inside the dining room, the entire family sat in a suffocating, hostile silence around a tray of completely untouched hospitality cookies. Emily looked incredibly small and defeated, staring intently at her polished fingernails while Daniel sat as far away from her as the chair allowed. My mother immediately assumed her classic defensive posture with her arms crossed, while my father completely refused to meet my gaze. Aunt Carol sat down, with her coffee cup and dryly asked who wanted to volunteer to tell the first lie of the afternoon. My mother immediately launched into a character attack, loudly telling everyone that I had always been an incredibly difficult and confrontational child. Emily began weeping on cue, a manipulative tactic that had historically forced everyone around her to drop their questions and comfort her. My father muttered that we weren't there to point fingers, prompting me to let out a cold laugh and state that the fingerprints were legally on the contracts anyway. I opened my legal binder and systematically laid out the entire timeline of events, from the country club entrance to the forged signature. I maintained a perfectly calm, low military tone, which seemed to terrify my mother far more than an explosive shouting match would have. When Emily attempted to excuse her behavior by weeping that she was under immense pressure, I looked her in the eye and told her that scared people ask for help, but they do not commit grand theft. My mother desperately chimed in that nobody stole anything because they always knew I would eventually step up to help them. That admission exposed their entire plan. They never intended to ask because they knew I would surrender once the financial trap was sprung. My mother eventually cracked under the weight of the evidence, weeping that she was the one who actually sent Emily my identification documents for the venue. The entire room fell into a horrifying silence as my father stared blankly at the table and Daniel looked away in pure disgust. Aunt Carol then walked over to a kitchen cabinet, retrieved a small personal notebook, and confronted Emily about a $6,000 medical loan she had taken the previous year. It was quickly revealed that there was never a medical emergency, and the notebook exposed a massive history of financial deception against multiple relatives. A pattern of manipulation emerged showing that everyone had quietly enabled her behavior under the assumption that the reliable older sister would eventually fix the fallout. I stood up from the table, looked at the family that had drained my spirit for decades, and clearly stated that I was no longer their ATM or their hidden secret. Daniel quietly announced that he and Emily needed an immediate separation, and as I walked out of the house into the evening air, nobody tried to stop me or beg for my forgiveness. Months have passed since that explosive afternoon in Owensboro, and the transition back to ordinary life at Fort Campbell was surprisingly peaceful. The venue legally transferred the entire $23,000 debt back to Emily and my mother, and my credit score completely recovered from the initial investigation. I recently moved into a smaller, wonderfully quiet apartment, close to the military base, and adopted an elderly rescue dog named Hank who spends his days sleeping on my balcony. I finally sought out professional therapy, where I learned the painful lesson that being continuously needed by your family is not the same thing as being genuinely loved. On a rainy evening in December, Emily called me to offer a genuine, tears-filled apology, admitting for the first time that she had always been intensely jealous of the absolute trust I commanded from others. I accepted her words calmly, but I did not offer her money, and I did not step forward to rescue her from the consequences of her ongoing marital separation. True peace didn't arrive with a dramatic explosion or a triumphant celebration. It arrived in the quiet safety of a locked apartment, an unburdened bank account, and the beautiful reality of self-respect. If you are currently the person everyone leans on but nobody bothers to protect, please remember that you are allowed to walk away from debts that were never yours to pay.